Chapter 18. What goes up must come down.
Ha ha ha, Mike, that all sounds like a pretty wild ride, man.
Robert, you don't know the half of it. Ultimately, I found myself right back where I started, slinging policies in the San Fernando Valley, sitting in a moderately sized office strip mall on the corner of First and Nowhere. Don't worry, the irony was not lost on me. I started back at the bottom rungs of the insurance industry. Maybe that's precisely where I belonged. Robert hadn't changed a bit from the last time we spoke. Thinking about it, I really missed conceiving our random back-and-forth banter sessions. Robert scoffed and said,
I knew you had the look. It was stamped across your forehead the second you strolled through those doors.
The look?
Yeah, the look. You know, the look of unbridled ambition. Hey, everybody, I'm too cool for school. The look,
Robert said with a patronizing tone. Ah, yes, the look. Robert was captivated by the whole story. I mean, if it didn't sound so absurd, it might even make a great book. Robert leaned forward with both hands clasped around his coffee mug. He was hanging on my every word.
Did you end up laying off all the brokers?
He inquired with the similitude of a news reporter hot on a story. Robert, that's more of a second cup of coffee kind of conversation. Speaking of which, why don't we reload our mugs? Without uttering a word, Robert downed what was left of his coffee and sprung up from his chair. As we got up from our chairs, a large crackling sound rang off. Apparently, we'd been drenching the pleather in sweat for the last 2 hours. As we began to walk back to the break room, Robert continued his inquisition.
Come on, tell me what happened. Did you lay off everyone or what?
It played out more or less like the consultants predicted.
More or less?
I mean, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. After we initiated the headcount reductions, about 10 or 20 of the employees turned state's evidence.
Turned? What do you mean?
Well, John wasn't lying when he said the house of cards would come tumbling down quickly. They ratted on Flushy and on the way out took proprietary data with them to the Fed, the district attorney, well, to anybody that would listen.
Yeah, like what?
Well, just ticky-tacky stuff, but enough to get the ball of yarn to unravel.
So did you ever get in contact with the FBI guy, John Daly?
I couldn't help but react with a terse laugh. John Daly. It turns out that wasn't even his real name. Sneaky FBI agents. Boy, isn't that the understatement of the century. Robert and I refilled our beverages, then headed back to the sales floor. I decided to take the sweetener back with me. Robert hadn't noticed at first. I started pouring the Irish cream sweetener into my mug. Robert looked at me with this disfigured expression.
What did they do to you over there?
Robert, I'm now a man of refined tastes.
Clearly. Did you want coffee with your creamer? Ha!
As I finished pouring the sweetener, it dawned on me that might make a perfect embarkation to continue with my earlier thought. What were we talking about again?
John Daly,
Robert eagerly said. Oh, yeah, John Daly. Something they kept out of the headlines and financial gossip columns was what happened to John Daly. John put his orbit too close to the sun and got burned. Robert began to drink his coffee slowly and methodically. This gave me plenty of room to hype up the story even more. Turns out his real name was Ralph Mancento, the kind of person under better circumstances that I might actually consider being friends with.
Well, spit it out. What happened to him?
I didn't peep a word. Instead, I decided to stir the sweetener in my cup. I grabbed a spoon off my desk and started swirling it around in my mug. As it swirled, the spoon occasionally made this annoying ding sound as it hit the edge of the cup. Ralph was caught by Flushy security snooping around after hours. He was poking his nose around where it didn't belong.
So how'd you find out?
After stirring the cup for several seconds, I abruptly and intentionally stopped. I held the mug close to my nose to appreciate the warm, wafting aroma of the freshly brewed coffee. Who do you think called security on him?
You snitched on an FBI agent?
Well, in all fairness to me, it was dark and I saw someone rummaging around after hours. I didn't know who it was. I took a big sip of that overly sweetened coffee. Man, did it taste bad, but better than jailhouse coffee. Our security converged on him like a highly trained SWAT team and, well, did what they do best.
What happened?
That night, I have no idea. The next day, however, I said, trailing off. I took a deep breath and gulped down the rest of my coffee. All I know is that the next day, somebody found his body in a dumpster somewhere in East Los Angeles. Robert was at a loss for words. His jaw was practically on the floor. Yeah, that's not the worst of it.
How could it possibly get any worse? Robert pleaded.
Oh, I was just about to find out. I shook my head and took a deep breath. Todd Dupree?
Yeah, what happened to Todd Dupree?
That's not an easy question to answer. I'm sure you read about it all in the papers. It was plastered all over the news for weeks.
I did.
Well, what did you read in the papers? I asked Robert with some trepidation and mystique.
Todd was the mastermind behind the entire scheme. He fled to some non-extradition European country with all the money and left Flushy holding the bag.
Uh-huh. That's what the paper said, did they? Robert looked at me with an inquisitive grin. I could tell he was hooked. The feeling of having someone hang on your every word was quite intoxicating. Here's what you didn't read in the papers. Let me ask you something, Robert. Are you familiar with the concept of a tontine?
Nope. What is it?
Let's say you and me pool our resources together and put $100 a week in a bank account for 50 years.
Okay.
What's going to happen if we combine funds for that many years?
Well, it's going to earn interest.
A lot of interest. Gobs of money. Ding! Give that man a prize, I said as I pointed to Robert.
So
the idea is that if one of the people in the tontine dies, the money is split among the surviving members of the tontine.
That sounds pretty great.
Does it? Let me ask you something else.
Shoot,
he said with fleeting interest. What if you're the one that dies? Better yet, what if the other members of the tontine decided to eliminate you?
Eliminate me? Like kick me out of the tontine?
Eliminate you as in 6 feet under eliminate you. Oh is right. The reason why tontines are illegal is that it creates a financial motivation for murdering the other members of the tontine.
So, what you're saying, what happened to Todd?
Todd was one of the 2 founding members and majority interest holder in Flushy. Todd was an innovator. Todd was a victim of his own success. Todd was an unknowing participant in the world's largest tontine. Robert was speechless, at least until he finished off his cup of coffee.
Tell me you at least got some of that sweet startup money out of this whole thing. What about the IPO? What about your equity in the company?
When we completed our second round of funding, the valuation was anticipated to be in the ballpark of $100 billion. Robert nearly had a heart attack. He grabbed his chest to exaggerate his excitement and surprise.
So what happened when you guys went public? Mike, spill the beans, man. Come on.
What happened? As part of my contract, I had the option to purchase up to 50,000 shares of the IPO. The IPO had an initial price per stock of $1,000. What happened? As part of my contract, I had the option to purchase up to 50,000 shares. I had the option to purchase up to 50,000 shares of the IPO. The IPO had an initial price per stock of $1,000.
Mike, you made $500 million? Are you telling me you walked away with $500 million and you ended up right back here? How?
No, not exactly, Robert.
Come on, man, what happened?
As part of my plea deal, the government forced me to pay restitution to our victims. They froze my assets before I could even see the zeros hit my bank account. Robert started laughing so hard his coffee nearly ran down his nose. In fact, we both laughed at my expense for a little bit. Robert covered his eyes, rubbing his entire face with his two hands. I walked away with a bunch of goose eggs and the pleasure of being a star witness in the world's largest Ponzi scheme trial.
Yeah, I read what happened to David.
I shook myself. Hung himself in his prison cell, allegedly.
Allegedly,
Robert replied in skeptical agreement. We both shook our heads for a second, given the morbid nature of the conversation. You know the craziest part about that? I asked Robert.
What?
Turns out he didn't even have a life insurance policy, I explained.
Blah! What? Unreal! How?
Yeah, what are the odds? Guess David was right. He wasn't a life insurance guy after all.
The $64,000 question is, Mike, how in the world did you end up working back here?
I swirled my coffee around in my mug, making these long, slow, concentric circles. Admitting defeat wasn't something I was accustomed to. Well,
he came back to work here because of common sense.
Bill stepped into the foreground, a cup of coffee in hand and a big fat grin on his face.
He came back because he knew how good he had it here in the first place. That should be a lesson for the lot of you. The grass ain't always greener on the other side.
Good morning, Bill, I responded as I turned around to greet my new boss. Turns out he was the same as my old boss. He raised his mug up. It was a classic Bill way to greet someone. Something so simple, yet at the very same time something so gracious. Bill didn't have to say it, but he had "I told you so" written all over his face. Ultimately, some of us float to the top and some sink to the bottom. But in the end, we all get flushed. The end.